we have a republic and use this democratic process. What happened in 1913 is the bankers took control of monetary policy. Monetary policy is I control the process by which currency is issued, including through credit. So I generally govern and control credit issuance.
Yes.
And from that, the currency, the creation and management of the currency. What they're trying to do now is take control of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is when I control the taxes and the borrowing of the U.S. government. I call it a financial coup. I think what happened was when the budget deal busted in 1995, they gave up on the government. They just said, this form of government will not work as a governance structure to manage the dollar system. So I think they decided, okay, we're going to re-engineer government on the just do it method. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull all the money out. We're going to put the government in a debt trap, and then we'll squeeze it and shift to the control model. This is the Boston Tea Party moment. Can they tax without representation? And then the question is, who are the real owners? And that's the mystery. And I've spent my whole life trying to figure out who are the real owners. And basically, from what experience I've had, if you know their name, they're not one of the important owners. Do you know what I mean? It's intergenerational pools of capital. Now, here's what's interesting. One of the most powerful pools of intergenerational capital that I've ever dealt with is the Harvard Endowment. And if you look at the squabble going on over who controls the Harvard Endowment right now, it's a very interesting squabble. The university is only a portion of the Harvard Corporation. The Harvard Corporation runs the university and it runs the endowment. Okay. And the Harvard Corporation, in my experience, is one of the most important investment syndicates in the world. And because they have a tax exemption, they don't have to pay taxes. And my theory is it was the model that was really created to sort of compete with the Vatican and the Catholics, who had 2,000 years of diplomatic immunity and no taxes. If you look at the group of people who meet through the BIS,
what's that?
The BIS is the Bank of International Settlements, and it's the central bank of central banks.
Where is that located?
It's in Basel, Switzerland. It has 63 of the most powerful central banks as its members, and the New York Fed and the Fed are both shareholders. They became shareholders in 1994.
In one sentence, what's the purpose of the Bank of International Settlements?
Okay, so there are two things you need to know about the Bank of International Settlements.
I'm not sure my brain's big enough for this, but keep going.
It is.
Okay.
It has sovereign immunity.
What does that mean?
It's above the law.
It's its own country.
Right. It's its own country. It has its own police force. No one has the legal authority to move against it. Okay. It has sovereign immunity. That's number one. Number two, it can move money and hold it on its balance sheet and manage money secretly. So if I want to, I'm grossly oversimplifying, if I want to steal 21 trillion from the U.S. government and park it on the balance sheet of the BIS, it can move it anywhere in the world and it can keep it on its balance sheet secretly.
Why would there be an organization? First of all, where does its power? Like, who empowered it to have sovereign immunity in the right?
It was created after World War I, collected its powers and got going in the 30s. And it was created in theory to manage the reparations of the German government. But if you read the real history, it was because the Bank of England and the central bankers wanted an entity that had sovereign immunity. They wanted to be able to move money secretly. So there's a wonderful book called The Tower of Basel by a wonderful Hungarian journalist where he documents and describes the whole history of the Bank of International Settlements. And if you want to understand power in this world, understanding how the Bank of International Settlements and the plumbing of the central banking system works is very, very important.
I've always been worried that if I knew more, that I would become mentally ill.
Reality is sort of the door that you open to find real solutions. And the biggest obstacle to implementing them is nobody wants to face it. And I understand that because the hardest thing I ever had to do, Tucker, was look in the mirror and say, I'm the patsy. I was the Assistant Secretary of Housing. I didn't know. And I went along and I didn't face this. I should have seen this faster. Sometimes it's harder than facing death to admit that you've been part of, a big lie and you've been tricked.
As someone who advocated for the Iraq War on television, I've lived this.
And we have to deal with it. And the real solutions will be cultural. There'll be millions of people acting in their own life, refusing to be controlled, individually. In October of 1997, that's the beginning of the 1998 fiscal year, enormous amounts of money started disappearing from the U.S. government. And literally, by the time of 9/11, there was 4.1 trillion missing from DOD and HUD. And if you remember, the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld stood up. He did a press conference and he said, there's 2.3 trillion in undocumentable adjustments last year at DOD.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
And then, of course, as you know.
Yeah, priorities changed.
Right.
For reasons that we still don't understand. And the average person, I think, sort of thinks, well, maybe there were 19 guys from Saudi or something.
I call the Patriot Act the Control and Concentration of Cash Flow Act. One of the things that happened after 9/11, if you look at the history of the black budget and sort of secret financing that the government uses for secret and classified projects, that pot of money had grown and grown and grown. And it had become very dysfunctional to try and get that money. Mortgage fraud, I believe, was one of the biggest sources. And that's why what I was doing sort of went into the heart of the problem. So I litigated with the Department of Justice for 11 years. Some of that was fisticuffing with the tax guys. But anyway, so I had this sort of enemy of the state process. I had 18 audits, investigations, 12 tracks of litigation, a smear campaign, and physical harassment.
So they didn't like what you were saying?
They didn't like the idea that I would try and stop the mortgage bubble. They really wanted to have a mortgage bubble. And we were doing things to bring disclosure. The Patriot Act and that whole process was very successful at moving a lot more money onto the budget. In other words, it made it much easier to get enormous amounts of money for the national security state. If you look at the financial crisis, what you're saying is these companies can lose trillions of dollars, have it replaced by the taxpayer and keep on going. A decision was made by Eric Holder in the Department of Justice to not prosecute HSBC. There's a wonderful video on the Best Evidence channel by John Titus about this whole thing. There's a definition under the BIS, under the Financial Stability Board, of a financially systemically important institution.
Right.
These institutions are free to break the law. At most, all they have to do is kick back a piece of the profits to the Department of Justice. So it's like a formal kickback system. And what you're saying is that you're taking the sovereign immunity of the BIS and through the New York Fed, extending it to the banks that are running these operations.
JP Morgan and the rest, Bank of America. Yeah.
Right. What you've done with the BIS, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, you've created all these different organizations. You've created an international overlay of organizations that have various forms of sovereign immunity. Of course, the big one being the BIS. I don't know if you ever saw it. One of the greatest explanations of globalization ever given. Sir James Goldsmith came to the United States in 1994 and he did an interview with Charlie Rose, and he described why we should never approve the Uruguay round of GATT and institute the WTO.
If you could summarize his argument, what would it be?
He said, we are going to hollow out the middle class in the West, and we are going to devastate our culture.
Our culture?
Yes, our culture. We're going to devastate our culture, and we're going to devastate the quality of the food supply.
He said that?
Yes. Now, those are my way of saying it. You should watch it. And I think to this day, I think it's the best description.
That China, in the new millennium, will be the world's fastest growing economy.
That's great.
And it'll be a market.
That's wonderful.
And those people will be buying products.
That's wonderful.
From the industrialized world.
And let's benefit from that. And we can work together. But how do you benefit from that without destroying ourselves? You go and you create a corporation in China. And you build a factory in China. And what do you want to sell? Mugs? Sell mugs in China. And you conquer part of the Chinese market by competing there fair and square in China. That's life. That's adding to the activity of China. You're a corporate citizen over there. You're working over there. But if you move a factory from the States and take that to China, not so as to conquer the Chinese market, but so as to re-import the goods into the States, so as to get cheap labor, what are you doing? What you are doing is you are saying to your employees here, you're too expensive, folks. You want money, you want protection, you want unions, you want holidays. Forget it. We can employ 47 people over there who want nothing. Economy is there to serve the fundamental needs of society.
Yes.
Which are prosperity.
Yes.
Which are stability.
Yes.
And which are contentment. If, purely for an economic doctrine, you have a situation whereby the economy grows, but you create poverty and unemployment, and you destabilize the society, you're in trouble.
The leadership knew that this would destroy or devastate the West. We were trying to exercise more and more control through the dollar system. And we've always exercised a lot of power and control and extracted a subsidy from the dollar system. But you have more and more people trying to get out of the system. And that deglobalization started in the financial crisis. So it's accelerating now, but it's not that we just started it. The White House, the Senate, the House, Republican and Democrat, all of them together, issued an administrative policy called Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board Statement 56. And what that policy said, we do not have to obey the constitutional provisions related to financial budgeting and disclosure. We do not have to obey the laws, and we do not have to obey the regulations. What we can do is appoint a secret group of people by a secret process to move money out of the financial disclosures of the United States, the 24 covered agencies, plus approximately 150 governmental entities. And when you throw in the classification laws and the national security laws, it also applies to the big banks and contractors working for the U.S. government. When I look at the U.S. large cap stock market or the U.S. bond market, the treasury market, I have no financial disclosure that has any meaning. Everything's secret. I have no idea what it means. If I pick up the financials of a New York Fed member bank that is running the U.S. Treasury Department's bank accounts, or if I pick up the Treasury financial statements, they're meaningless. They don't mean anything.
What's missing?
You can't know. All you can know is a secret group of people can make whatever they want go missing, and you can't know what it is. It's all secret. As a legal matter, to take the position that an administrative policy agreed upon by the uniparty can overrule the Constitution, can overrule the laws, and can overrule the regulations simply by you wave the wand and suddenly magically law doesn't matter. Between fiscal 1998 and fiscal 2015, there were 21 trillion of undocumentable adjustments. So the question is, where's all this money going? And one of the things I've looked at is the underground base and city infrastructure and transportation system that's been built. And
I'm sorry?
So we have built an extraordinary number of underground bases and supposedly transportation systems. Some of these are some of these are documented as part of the national security infrastructure. I think there are many more.
In the United States?
In the United States, and all over the world. To me, there are two purposes. You have so many activities going on that you need to keep secret that you're basically building the capacity to, for example, if you're doing a secret space program, you need to platform it from, things that can't be seen. But I think if you're worried about a near extinction event, I don't know if you ever saw, Washington Post did a project, it was in 2010 or 12, called Top Secret America, and put together a database of all the different top secret installations that had been built in the country, including since the Patriot Act. And what you saw was just this explosion of money in building so many, both underground and above ground facilities. How do a few sneak up on the many? Well, you have to do it very quietly and visibly before you throw the trap.
Smart.
So essentially what they're building because it's converting a currency system into a control system. So it's really the end of currency. And what they're doing is they've been building the different digital pieces. And when it integrates and comes together, then you literally have a digital concentration camp. It's complete and utter control. What we're talking about is a system where you can surveil, control, and influence one person at a time. And with AI and software, each person can have their custom surveillance, influence, nudging, and control system.
And punishment.
Yes, enforcement. So go back and think of the pandemic. So if I say you can't go more than a mile from your home, and I say you have to be mandated a pharmaceutical, then if you don't take the pharmaceutical, I can turn off your money. If you go more than a mile away from your home, your money and your credit cards won't work. In 2020, when the pandemic started, or it was October 2020, so the pandemic was underway, the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements was on an IMF panel. And in 1 minute, it's the first time in my life I ever saw a central banker tell the truth. I fell off my chair. And he said, the beauty of this is we can set the rules on how your money works, and we have the technology to enforce them. So look at what they did to the Canadian truckers. We don't like what you're doing. We cut off your money, and we cut off your friends' money. And if people help you, we cut off their money too. So I've known so many different people around the country who've been debanked. We just got legislation passed in Tennessee that a bank over a certain size couldn't debank someone for political or religious reasons. During the Biden administration, Biden nominated somebody for control of currency who was ultimately not approved. The Republicans in the Senate killed the nomination. Before she was nominated, 3 weeks before, she wrote an article in the Vanderbilt Law Review that said the great thing about central bank digital currency, in other words, an all digital currency system, is you have the perfect tool to deal with inflation. If inflation gets out of hand, you just freeze everybody's bank accounts. The litigation starts, and literally you go from being very wealthy and very trusted and very respected to being an enemy of the state. No one will talk to you. Nobody will answer your phone. And suddenly all your income stops. All your income stops. Your credit stops. You're just frozen.
And by yours, you mean yours.
Yeah. So anyway, you have the assets that you have. Luckily, they never turned off my bank account, so I was lucky that way. But one of the things that happened was I'd had a farm in New Hampshire, and I sold my share to my uncle. And I warned him, if you buy this, they may come after you too. I sell him the farmland. They call him and they say, your niece is a criminal and you shouldn't be doing this. They show up at his house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at 9 p.m. at night, 3 FBI guys and a HUD IG guy with a subpoena. And it was designed to scare him. So the family had a big powwow. Should they drop me because they don't want to be targeted? He said she helped everyone, so I'm going to help her. At the end of the process, when I won the litigation, we got money coming in. I sat down to either repay everybody who loaned me or gifted me money. I counted it up, and what I realized is I had come into the litigation having loaned $250,000, and then over the next 9 years, exactly $250,000 had come back. And Tucker, if it wasn't for that money, I wouldn't be here. I would never have made it through. And it was because it was in the people bank, and they couldn't shut the people bank off. They could do all sorts of things to shut off all sorts of resources and income. But if it's in the people bank and the people you love and trust, it comes back. They put my 401k under audit so I couldn't use it to finance the business. It was dirty tricks. Anyway, so I take the money out. So my accountant, when we get the settlement money, she said, let's fund up the 401k. I said, no, I'm never going into business with the U.S. government again. But the other thing is I'm taking that